All right, welcome to Halitics on Thursday, and getting just a bit of a late start this morning because of the decision. You're seeing the headline there from the New York Times on affirmative action just handed down in the past hour, maybe 45 minutes ago, and I was trying to get some information on it as well as rearranging my segments slightly because obviously this is big news. And I'll break this down a little bit, not too much. I really didn't have enough time to really get all my ducks in a row in terms of discussing the decision by the court. I think it was it 7-2 or I guess it must have been 6-3 with Sotomayor, Ketanji Jackson Brown, and the third Democratic justice voting against it. Now I can't even remember who that would be. Is it Breyer? Is he still on the court? Why do I think it was? I guess it was. Is he still on it? Or there's a. I guess it's Breyer. If you want to talk about this, 240-363-7190, 240-363-7190. I am going to put a blurb up in a little bit from Justice Thomas because I thought it was a little bit interesting what he had to say. That said, of course, the entire court is corrupt by huge money interests. And the two biggest stories, I think the two justices who are least credible are Alito and Thomas, based on their close ties to billionaires who have cases before the court or who are clearly interested financially and or by virtue of their activities in cases before the court. So I don't take their actual, I don't view them as sincere in any way. But if they raise an interesting point, I'm still going to respond to it and address it. So this decision is a momentous decision, clearly. And what you're seeing from the New York Times, and obviously they're scrambling as well, is a conclusion that, and I don't think this is really too debatable, that you're going to see a significant drop in the representation of African American and Native American or Indian American, not from India, but from the United States, what is now called the United States, people who were indigenous to this area before the Europeans colonized it. You'll see their percentages, which I believe are already well below, or somewhat below, in the case of African Americans, below the national average of their representation, will drop, and you'll see a significant increase in Asians and white students as a percentage of enrollees, especially at what they call elite or top schools, which obviously, without question, include Harvard and the University of North Carolina. So one thing that I wanted to just understand, and I haven't been, in a law class for years. I took a class in legal ethics a few years ago when I was considering returning to the practice of law, but fortunately I thought better of doing so and did not. But in terms of constitutional law, it's been, 30 plus years, 35 years or so, since I was in a classroom learning from the brilliant professors at the University Law Center at Georgetown. The professor Mike Seidman that I've had on this program when it was a radio show was one of my favorites, and we maintained our relationship. But frankly, I haven't done a lot of research on the 14th Amendment or the justifications for considering whether universities can or cannot, under the Constitution, take race into account. And I get the argument. We'll see what Thomas has to say. Certainly that, and let's see if we can get that slide looking a little better. I get the argument, and I think I agree with the argument, that because of historical inequality, historical inequity, and because we want to live in a decent society, the courts can require anyone who does business, not just a state, but anyone who does business within a state, to treat all clientele the same, regardless of their race, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their gender. That, I think, is a hallmark of a good society. You don't get to distinguish among your customers and treat some differently than others, or refuse to serve people based on race. It seems that the 14th Amendment, as I read it, definitely goes that far, because businesses, if they engage in interstate transit and the like, are covered under the Constitution. And the 14th Amendment doesn't specifically prevent you from considering, it doesn't prevent the U.S. government from saying you have to. In fact, I think it obligates that government ultimately to look at what different businesses and what different states are doing, and are they treating people badly, differently, unfairly, prejudicially because of their race. I think that's kind of pretty darn clear. But whether the government has the authority to step in and say to a private institution like Harvard, we're not going to let you try to redress historical wrongs, I think is a more difficult question. And so let me just put up because the 14th Amendment was the basis. It wasn't some federal statute or some state statute. The 14th Amendment was the basis for the decision that schools, whether state or private institutions like Harvard, cannot even consider race when taking when making decisions about enrollment, when making admissions decisions. They can't. The private university can't do it. And this is what Justice Thomas relied on. I'm just not clear how the 14th Amendment goes so far that it allows for that kind of intrusion into the way the university does business. So what the actual text of the Equal Protection Clause in the first section of the amendment, which is what the court relies on in the decision, is no state shall make or enforce any law which abridges the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. No state. So there's no law, right? I mean, it's the decision of Harvard, and we'll leave the University of North Carolina out of it because for now, the University of North Carolina is a state actor. It's acting, it's an arm of the state of North Carolina. So clearly, it is state action we're talking about when it comes to North Carolina. Now, I know there's a long line of decisions that talk about how these private schools take a lot of money from the government, and they're essentially, in many cases, arms of the government. I get all that. But it's still not the state that's making the admissions decision. It's still, in the case of a private school like Harvard, Yale, what have you, my college, Wesleyan, which will be impacted for sure by this decision, it's not a state acting. And nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor denied any person. So again, the state may not deny any person the equal protection of the laws. So again, I'm not seeing where this amendment would cover directly a private university. Now, I would note that you could argue, I suppose, that white students are not protected, or Asian students aren't getting equal protection by the university because they're using higher standards when it comes to test scores and GPAs, especially for Asians. You could make that argument, but it's still not a law, right? It's just the way Harvard decided it's going to make decisions when it sees applications, and it rules on applications. It's not a law. Now, I get how this is more likely to cover the state of North Carolina, and this specifically University of North Carolina, or any state college or university like North Carolina State, if you want to stay within the Tar Heel state. If the court deems the treatment of students or applicants differently based on their race as a denial of equal protection, then I can understand where the argument would be the state of North Carolina must say to its arms, its institutions, its appendages, you must treat every student the same. If you don't, at least you must treat them the same when it comes to race. You can't use a different standard when it comes to race for some students. In other words, if they're of color, if they're from a group that's traditionally marginalized, or doesn't, have it's the average person or the median person within that group is poorer, makes less money, has a lower income, you don't get to put a thumb on the scale to make sure that there are enough in your university to show the same representation as within the state as a whole. I kind of get it. When it comes to the state of North Carolina. It is a state actor. Then the question is it denying equal protection? Then there's another question. Does this count? Does providing a different standard, and people would say a lower standard when it comes to certain groups, when it comes to admitting them, is that denying equal protection? And we can argue that point. But I do understand that rationale. Where I have problems is that this decision also includes schools like Harvard, Yale, where Thomas went. That to me is a pretty big stretch. So I don't really, I'm not really comfortable that decision is in any way justified by the law. I mean, this is, by the way, without any regard to what I personally believe should be the policy. I'm not stating what my view is. I haven't yet stated it. I will share it. And I've written about this extensively. At least if you go to DAGblog and you search for HSG, I wrote about conflicts within the New Jersey school system between Asians and white students, or Asians and white parents, and why they had different views on how the school should operate. So I think, I'm not going to refuse to talk about this. Unfortunately, I didn't get clips from that. I just didn't have time. I was scrambling. By the way, join me, 240-363-7190. I know you have a position, 240-363-7190. That's the whole reason I do this, is because I want to talk to you. I want your opinions. I say in the description, no third rails on Halitics. And unfortunately, at least from my perspective, there are a lot of third rails in progressive politics. And certainly race is one of them. It's very, very, a Barack Obama and others. I want to have, I'm trying to get a principal, or I guess they call them a head of a private school, a private K through 12 school in New York City, who says we have to have the hard conversations about race. And I want to have that conversation with him. I want to know what a hard conversation about race looks like, and I want to engage with him in that, because I'm not really quite certain what that hard conversation looks like. I have some ideas, though. I'm not saying I'm, being disingenuous. I have ideas, but I'm not sure what he thinks is a hard conversation, and may or may not be different than what I think is a hard conversation about race. In any event, this is a topic that can cause, people to get canceled or get criticized or attacked if you say something that somebody really takes offense to. And we also live in two different Americas where there's a Venn diagram, of the coastal elites and educated people and Democrats who are in one diagram when it comes to the issues like affirmative action, and pretty much all in. And if you aren't for it, then you're, racist, and you're systemic racist and this and that. And on the other hand, you have a group that on the right that is, almost fundamentally opposite on that view. And they're the side that the court is a majority is made up of. This seems is comprised of at this point. So this is a very significant decision, and it's going to change higher education in America. I don't really see any way to not have that happen. I think that the reason we have affirmative action, I think the biggest reason this has occurred is because we have failed as a society to address economic injustice. I truly believe that the impetus for affirmative action comes from the remarkable advantages that going to a top school, an elite institution like Harvard or the University of North Carolina confer on their graduates, whether it's the networking, whether it's the perception that you are, because you got into that school, you're smarter than other people, or that because you went to that particular school. And I think there's some truth to it, and there's also a lot of myth making around it. But the perception that if you graduated from the University of North Carolina or Harvard, you must be smarter than the average person. You must have gotten a better education. You must know more. And, I'm not saying that's completely false, but I think there's a lot that isn't accurate about that either. But because of that perception, people who go to top universities and colleges make a lot more money than everyone else. They do a lot better than other people. That's one reason. And the other reason is because we live in such a profoundly unequal society where, if you want to call it a meritocracy, there's something to that. It's not completely false. But the people whose merit comprises going to a top university, getting a great degree in engineering or mathematics that allows them to parlay that into a job at Silicon Valley, top connections, and ultimately, a $1 billion corporation, startup, or CEO. Because that happens, because some people get everything and most people get very, very little, the spots, there's extraordinary competition and desire for spots at these schools. And basically it's fighting between groups, sadly, or that's how the elites have set it up, pitting different groups to compete against each other for the opportunity to maybe get a seat at the big table at the top of the pyramid. That's what a degree, that's what admission to a top university buys you. So this has become incredibly fraught, incredibly tense. If it didn't matter that much, in terms of your future earning capacity, in terms of your future lifestyle, in terms of how well your children lived or will live, which was the case in the 1950s and at least, in the 60s, where CEOs made 25 times what the average worker in their corporation made. So it was better. It was a lot better. You lived a lot better if you were at the top of the tree rather than on a branch in the middle of the tree, sure. But even if you were on that branch, you were doing okay. And the person at the top of the tree wasn't way 20 branches, 400 branches above you. So because of this inequality, we are scrambling, we're fighting. The prize is so high, so great that people just will do anything, right? And this is going to cause increased tension. It's going to cause increased rancor, anger. We saw it with the woman getting the degree at Queens College. Say my name, get my name right. And I thought her behavior was inappropriate, but I get people who feel who are living less well see this as a black-white issue, see it as a racism issue. I understand why they would feel that way. I can't say they're wrong. So the way to address it, in my opinion, isn't for elite institutions to make their decisions on whom to admit, in part based on the color of the skin of the applicant. It's to take them out of the equation when it comes ultimately to how much better you get to live if you go to a top school. It should be a little better. It shouldn't be Harvard that's getting to decide who goes to the top and who doesn't. It should be we all live a decent life. We all have enough and no one has too much. I think then college and universities could get back to their core mission of educating the best students, the most accomplished students, the students who will most learn and take advantage, not in terms of making billions, but in terms of just increasing knowledge and making life better for everyone. 240-363-7190, 240-363-7190. So I think, where I ultimately come down, I'll say this, and just before, here's what Thomas had to say. And I think it's really interesting that Thomas adopts such a broad view, right, of the 14th Amendment, that it includes Harvard, right? It includes a private university, not just a state, but the private university. This is really remarkably hypocritical of Thomas, of course, because he has consistently embraced the limited view of the Constitution, that we should look to the founders. We should look to the framers. We shouldn't go beyond the plain language of the statutes or the amendments and read into them what isn't there. And yet he reads into the 14th Amendment a positive requirement that non-private, that private, non-state actors must eschew any race factors in admissions. I mean, that's an extremely broad view when you consider how the 14th Amendment provides only that states are barred from treating different people differently. So Thomas embraces a very broad view, but he goes on to say, and I think this is applicable to the 14th, to the University of North Carolina, it is not correct to take the view that the 14th Amendment forbids only laws that hurt but not help blacks. He says, Thomas, that this theory lacks any basis in the original meaning of the 14th Amendment. So he's saying you can't pick and choose. You can't say, well, because this particular law, which, the North Carolina University, UNC is applying, Chapel Hill is applying, because it helps black people, the 14th Amendment allows it. He says no, because the 14th Amendment says you can't pick and choose based on race who wins or who loses under the law, which I think is certainly a defensible view. I'm not sure I fully embrace it, but I think it's defensible. I don't think that logic holds when it comes to a private school, private university. So again, I think Thomas has a very expansive view because he is very clearly opposed to any kind of affirmative action because he's extremely conservative. He's a hard right guy, and he gets money from hard right people. So that's why. But I think ultimately there's something to that argument, and I think what colleges and universities should do, because I'll just say my opinion, you can join me if you want, 240-363-7190, is recognize clearly that they have a duty to represent society in their student bodies. That's part of the core mission of universities, is to have to be educating people who are going to go through society, and as leaders, some of them in various ways. And we want a leadership class. We want an educated class. We want a highly educated class to be representative of the entire population. I think that there are times when this leads to inequities and inequalities, especially when you look at groups that are high achieving, and they're held to a standard that I just don't think is fair. So I do think that it's appropriate for schools to look at the challenges that students face and to include in that challenge the situation that may occur if they're living in very difficult circumstances, if they have fewer opportunities, if their family is less well educated. But I think it seems from my experiences that they go too far, that there are too many people who are extremely well credentialed, who don't get into certain schools, who probably deserve to get in. And I have a problem with that, especially because it does appear that those are people who are being discriminated against based on their race. And that's not right. So I know I'm cutting that baby very, very fine. I know that may not be as definitive a line as people would like, but I guess that's where I come down. And I think one of the other issues that troubles me is that you see people who benefit from affirmative action, even though they're not from in any way what I would consider to be an underprivileged or challenging background. And I think that's problematic as well. I think ultimately this conflict would be greatly reduced if the prize weren't so great and the cost of not getting it weren't so high. All right, I will not let this topic die. I will continue to focus on it. I don't have all the info. I haven't spent that much time studying it. I want to talk a little bit about the article I wrote about New Jersey. I'll get to that tomorrow because I haven't focused on that. I do spend a lot of time platforming my favorite group right now, and that is climate defiance. And I think we are at a point where we must take direct action. We must go to the streets. There has to be civil disobedience. I'm a little bit wimpy about that. I don't really, I don't relish getting arrested. That's not something I want for me. But that said, I think we need to. I think we need to be willing to put ourselves on the line. And I'm trying to get myself to that place. These folks are doing it, and I give them all the credit in the world. Here's Climate Defiance in Chicago, taking on the President, Joe Biden. And let me make sure you can see all that. So this was yesterday. And there they are in the streets of Chicago with that enormous banner taking up the space. I just think that's just awesome. I think that's friggin' awesome that they did that. They stopped Biden's motorcade, and or at least he had to slow down. He had to see it. And this is, he promised. He said he was going to be an environmental president, and that's just not what we're seeing. Just like we didn't see that with Obama. Obama claimed he would be an environmental president, and he then, after he left office, gloated about how he made us the number one producer of natural gas and oil in the world. So it doesn't matter. I mean, it just doesn't matter who's president, which party at this point. It doesn't matter if they acknowledge the reality of the anthropogenic climate crisis and the Anthropocene age that we live in now, the age of man, and the sixth great extinction which man is causing. It doesn't matter if they're open to that theory, which is really fact. It doesn't matter if they're going to continue to provide dispensations to oil, gas, and coal. That's where we are right now, and it's so sad, so tragic. One of my great regrets is that I feel that I'm not as able as I would like. I'm not as capable as I'd like. I'm not as competent as I'd like to get people to see this and to act in a way that's consistent. And I believe in the fossil fuels tax, but I can't impose that. I have no power to do that. I know most of you don't. I don't understand why not, but you don't. But what I can say to you is if we don't elect Dr. Cornel West, things will get worse. I was going to say we're not going to solve the problem. I don't know if we solve it with Dr. West, although he certainly says all the right things and has also walked the walk. I don't know that the President of the United States has the power to stop the climate catastrophe. I think that they have a lot of ability to make things better. And so far, we've had presidents who are only making things worse. So here's the description I made for the image I did for today's program, still cooking. There you see a man in Austin, that's Austin, Texas, shirtless. You can get a sense of just how boiling hot it is in Texas. And I circled there extreme caution is the, which isn't great. Let me tell you what, extreme caution isn't good. That's sort of the lighter orange. The dark orange is danger. So I believe we have about 8 or 9 states that are in the dangerous region, including all Mississippi, all Louisiana, much of Texas, almost all of Arkansas, parts of Florida as well, all the way north into Missouri. So that's dangerous. That's how hot it is in this country right now. Dangerous. It's the climate catastrophe. It is really the apocalypse that's hitting us. And we're not only talking about heat. We're also talking about smoke. And that smoke is from the fires. It's also the climate catastrophe. It's also the cataclysm. It's also human caused. The smoke from the Canada fires. And we have another 8 states. You can see the code reds and purples. I think purple is worse, right? Purple's worse than red. Washington, D.C., where I am, you can sort of see a little purple dot in there. That is the worst air in the country right now, as I understand it. So this was yesterday. Things are worse today. So there you go. I mean, there it is. And let me see if I can get that. Just a little more here from your Washington Post. Code purple or unhealthy air quality was observed in eastern Iowa, southern Wisconsin, northern Illinois this morning. So that's worse than red. Another zone of code purple hourly observations runs from Michigan to Ohio and western Pennsylvania, which were also impacted Wednesday. Today in D.C., we're code purple. So, whole country, not the whole country, much of the country, Yeah. We do need a president who gets it. We absolutely do. I think there's only one that we can rely on. I'll play a little clip from him, but I want to also just a few more quick slides for you. Again, from the Washington Post. Yeah, so we're talking about heat, we're talking about haze, we're talking about incredibly bad air that our kids are breathing, we're breathing. And by the way, this absolutely can cause lung cancer. There will be more and more cases of lung cancer due to pollution, air pollution, as opposed to smoking. Fewer of us smoke cigarettes, that's good, thankfully. But because of what we're doing to our air, more of us are going to get lung cancer. And it's horrible. It's an awful way to die. It's an awful way to get sick. I am all in for Dr. West. I still read, I still see folks who are supporting RFK Jr., who support Marianne Williamson. I see arguments, well, West can't win, you're just talking, you're just blathering. I don't really get it. I don't think it's just talk. I'm certainly calling for action. And so is Dr. West. We're saying get behind his campaign. We're saying support him. We're saying vote for Green candidates because the Democratic Party is not on our side. It is ultimately on the side of the fossil fuel industry. I do want to play this clip. I'll end with RFK Jr. I've been spending a lot of time on him. I know there are people who like RFK Jr. Jimmy Dore likes RFK Jr. I think the feeling is, and I get it, this guy is super anti-establishment, even though he's a Kennedy and, that family has been part of the establishment and made billions as a family. He's not a billionaire by any means. I don't know if I'm not sure how much he has, maybe a few dozen million. I really don't know. I get that resentment of all elites. But ultimately, what has to matter is policy. Is your policy, is what you're proposing appropriate for the problem that we're trying to respond to? And I just don't get why people would think that this guy, with his crypto, with his refusal to state we're going to raise taxes on the wealthy. I mean, the biggest problems we face are the climate cataclysm, and which is driven in large part by massive wealth and income inequality. And if this guy can't even say, I support Medicare for all, if this guy can't even say, I support higher taxes on the rich, how do we think he's going to address, what policy is he going to push that will make things better? I don't get that. Show me, tell me, let me see it. Because I'd love to support somebody in the Democratic primary who can beat Biden, or at least can make Biden uncomfortable if I ultimately think they're on my side. But how is RFK Jr. shown that? His policies. Because whatever you say, we talk about people saying, oh, you're just talking a lot, but you can talk all you want about corruption and the whatever RFK Jr. talks about. But if you're not going to propose real solutions to the problems that you identify, it doesn't matter. All right, here he is on Crystal and Sagar.
Seen in the these documents in the 1970s were Exxon's own science. Exxon had scientists working for them that prided themselves on knowing more about the fate of the carbon molecule in the environment than anybody else. And during that time in the 70s, they were saying to their bosses in the Exxon management, if we continue to burn carbon the way that we are going to warm the globe. And that actually is going to be a bad thing for humanity, but it's going to be a great thing for our company because we're going to melt the Arctic. And there's a tremendous amount of oil under the Arctic, and we're going to be able to exploit it. So you had people.
All right, so that is, I think, accurate. I wasn't aware that the ExxonMobil scientists actually said, hey, guess what? We're not only going to burn up the planet, but we're going to get more oil because we're burning up the planet under the Arctic. I'm not aware of those particular notes or those memoranda by ExxonMobil scientists, but it doesn't surprise me. I bet it's true. It certainly is plausible. I don't see that, RFK Jr. would necessarily make that up, and it passes my smell test for sure. So, you want to call these people genocidal, sociopathic maniacs. I'm good with that. And I don't think it's too strong. So if RFK Jr. seems to really understand this, which is that the company, the biggest, most powerful, richest in the world at that time, and maybe still, well, it isn't now, I guess, because the tech companies are richer. I don't know if they're more powerful. That corporation concluded that its own activities would bring about Armageddon. So you get it, right? I mean, how could you possibly state that and not be a complete opponent, a complete enemy of the oil, gas, and coal industry? Why wouldn't you make war on them? It seems that that's what you should be doing. But that isn't what he's going to be doing. He tells us.
People who were on the industry side back in the 70s who were saying this is real. Now, in my campaign, I'm not going to be talking a lot about climate. Why is that? Because climate has become a crisis like COVID that the Davos group and other totalitarian elements in our society have used as a pretext for clamping down totalitarian controls.
All right, so this is what Jimmy Dore says also, and that's why they invited Greta. That's part of this conspiracy theory. That's why they invited Greta Thunberg to Davos, because they want to platform the climate catastrophe. These elites, these billionaire elites at Davos, Hillary Clinton's there as well, that they want to platform climate activists because they'll use, or they are using the climate catastrophe to seize even more power. That's the theory. So because of that, I don't want to talk about it. Well, I don't understand. I'd like an example. See, first thing I want is an example. Give me a law. Give me a policy that is being implemented right now, or that's even being proposed right now, that is going to reduce our freedoms. Purportedly because we need to address the climate crisis, the human caused, of which it's indisputable, right? I mean, I get people dispute it, but there's no evidence to support an argument that it's not real. So if you're going to say the reason I don't want to talk about global burning is because elites will then seize on it to, I don't know, lock me up in my house or kill every 10th person. If that's your fear, provide examples. How has this happened so far? Where is this happening? What country, what repressive regime is using the climate crisis to clamp down on citizens? The countries that are most responsible for it: Russia, Saudi Arabia, the United States, Canada. They're all massive producers, right, of the dirty fossil fuels. Where are they using the crisis? I'm not saying these aren't repressive regimes necessarily. Two of the worst, right? Saudi Arabia, Russia, very repressive countries. Okay, I get it. They're repressive, but they're not clamping down. They're the ones that are producing the oil and gas. They're the ones. I mean, they're not clamping down based on the fossil. They're clamping down for sure, but they're not clamping down because they're saying we have to fight global warming. Just the opposite. So his logic is senseless, but he doesn't want to offend, I guess, the conspiracy people who have decided with evidence-free decision. And I, by the way, saw this when I was in California, and there was a guy, Bob Oliver, and he was like, well, the oil, I would say, well, and he would say, well, you can't tax fossil fuels because that's going to help ExxonMobil. And I'm like, do you understand economics? When you tax a product, its price goes up to the consumer and they buy less of it. So therefore, it hurts ExxonMobil if we tax petroleum products because people will buy less of that and then that will cost them in profits. So you're wrong. It hurts the fossil fuel industry to tax their product at a higher level. So the response was, and this left me totally, silent. I had nothing. The response is that ExxonMobil is the government. You can't, if the government raises taxes, then that brings more money into the government, which means ExxonMobil gets more money. So I really didn't have, I was like, wow, okay. But here's the answer to that. Yes, ExxonMobil is very, very tight with our government, both parties, and has remarkable influence over both parties. That's why we don't have a carbon tax. That's why they're not doing what the government, our representatives aren't doing what's right. It's not that ExxonMobil wants a carbon tax and they're not getting it, because if they got it, it would increase their wealth and power. It's the complete opposite. They don't want it, and that's why we don't have it. And I don't know where to go with this, because this is just, it's crazy. It's crazy that we have to worry about talking about an existential crisis. It's not just a threat, it's reality. It's now. We're supposed to not talk about it because, wait, what was it again? Oh, because we might risk losing our freedoms, which we're not losing because of the crisis. We're losing because of the crisis, which we're not addressing, not because of the way we're addressing it. Just saying it boggles my mind.
But isn't that even more of a justification, if you think that, isn't that even more of a justification for you to argue in favor of an approach that doesn't result in the totalitarianism that you're fearful of?
Exactly. So
let me just interrupt, because I think he understood the question, but it was a great question by Crystal Ball, which was, well, if you really think that the reason we shouldn't talk about the climate catastrophe is because some bad actors will try to use it to increase their power and clamp down on citizens, if that's your real legitimate concern, then why don't you talk about it and propose solutions that won't result in people losing their freedoms? If this is the real worry, Bobby, why aren't you just presenting solutions that will work and that won't cost us our freedoms, since this is such a terrible threat to humanity? So let's hear what he has to say.
I've always been cautious about leaning on scientific evidence for climate, because the reason is it's not persuasive to people who don't want to believe it. I worked for commercial fishermen on the Hudson River for most of my career and all across the country. They love the environment. Most Republicans love the environment. If you tell them you're going to protect this place, this sacred place, your backyard, the water for your children, you're going to protect against toxicity, they're all in. This should not be a divisive issue. The environment should not be a divisive issue.
I understand what you're saying.
But it's hard to persuade people that lines on a graph that say that sometime in the future you're going to suffer. Take my word for it.
All right. So this ridiculous. That is the worst possible argument. We're not talking about the future. We're talking about right now. People get it. How could they not? How could we not get the climate crisis when half the country is shrouded in smoke that it never has been before? How can we not get it when every summer is hotter than the last? You talk about commercial fisher people. You don't think they get it? They see the smaller catches. They feel the water warmer every year. Obviously, they understand it. So again, this is how you can unite people. This is how you can unify people, by talking about direct impacts that they're feeling and how you're going to make things better for them. How if you're in power, you can make things better for them. Nobody does this the way Dr. West does. And your fear, I guess, that you'll... maybe he's talking to clearly he's talking to the wrong people. He's and it's just not, I mean, we're not gonna, let me say it this way, unless we talk frankly, honestly, rally people against the malefactors, against the ones who are making their lives worse, rather than fearing that somehow they'll manipulate and we have to fight on their battlefield, not on the one they choose. If we do that, we lose. The only way we win, and I do my best to persuade people. I guess I'm not very good at it. With evidence, with data, with facts, with logic. The only way we win is, as Dr. West points out, we only win the struggle with ecological catastrophe by coming together, talking about militarism, predatory capitalism, and how it's hurting everyone. I think RFK Jr. gets that. I think he gets, to a degree, the connection between militarism and predatory capitalism, ecocide, and the war on workers. I think he gets that, but he's gone down this rabbit hole of conspiracy theories that renders him clearly unfit to be president. Now, before you get all upset with me for saying that, I don't think he's the only person who's unfit. I don't think anyone running for president is fit to be president except for Dr. Cornel West. And I also do think, and I said, that unless we work together to elect Dr. West, we're not that we're running out of time. We're basically out of time. And on that cheery, optimistic, positive note, join me for the free-for-all tomorrow. I hope you'll call in if you get a chance. I hope you'll talk to me. You won't have a chance for a little bit after tomorrow.